You may know the beloved and famous movie monster Frankenstein, and you may have read the Frankenstein novel that inspired this character, but many do not know the true story of the author behind Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. Today we're going to be talking about Mary Shelley, an 18-year-old English author of Frankenstein, one of the most famous and influential novels in English literature. A tale of life and death and love and revenge. Welcome to my Fearless Faces series, a series where I do my makeup while talking about influential and historical women throughout time. Women who have changed history or are doing things to change history now, and some who may not have always gotten the recognition they deserved. While telling you about Mary Shelley's life, I will be doing a Frankenstein makeup look, trying to stick more to the description of Frankenstein in the book rather than the green bolt neck monster that we all know and love. Quick trigger warning, this story is a bit more on the morbid side at times, including things like death, child loss, mental illness, and the possibility of taking one's own life. And just a disclaimer that some of this has been told through historians, letters, third-person accounts, and different things. Some of what we know of Mary is speculation, rumor, or might have differing accounts. For today's makeup look, the main thing I'm going to be using is the Mayron Sin Wax. This will help the stitch elements and kind of the exposed skin look a little bit more realistic. We'll be adhering the Sin Wax with the liquid latex. Then for the coloring, we're going to be using Mayron's Aqua or water-activated face paints. And for some of the vein shading, we're going to be using the Ben Nye Color Wheel. To get started with white face paint, I'm going to kind of sketch out the area where I want these wounds to go. So Mary was born August 30th, 1797 in London, just before the turn of the 19th century. And to set the scene for this time period, King George III was reigning at the time. He was known as the Mad King and was known for his various mental illnesses that he was believed to have. So what I'm doing here is kind of creating an area where like the skin has started to rip apart. It would have at one time been stapled together, but now it's kind of separating and showing the exposed muscle underneath. And also to set the scene for how it was for women at this time, women were not allowed to vote. They couldn't own any property. It was considered like their father's property until they got married, and then it would be their husband's. And then their identity was kind of absorbed into their husband's, and he could kind of choose what happened with his wife. And women and girls were not educated at this time very well. They did sort of enough to be able to read and write and do math, but other than that, they were kind of taught to run a household and to cook, clean, and take care of their husbands. But Mary's upbringing was very different. Her father, William Godwin, was considered a radical philosopher, and he wrote a lot of things about challenging authority and societal norms. But her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and it was considered one of the earliest works of feminist philosophy. So in a world where a woman's role was considered to manage the home, take care of her husband, and to reproduce, she felt like women were entitled to education and to make their own choices and have their voices heard. But tragically, Mary never got to know her, because 11 days after Mary was born, she had died from an infection, and this was believed to be from unclean medical practices. So now her father was left to raise her and her half-sister alone. Her half-sister came from a previous relationship that Mary had, and that daughter was called Fanny. Even though Godwin, in some of his writings, said that he did not encourage marriage, he ends up getting married again to Mary Jane Clairmont. A lot of Marys in this story. Mary Jane came into the relationship with 2 children of her own from a previous relationship, and then there was 2 that Godwin had, and one of them, Claire, became close friends with Mary. But the relationship with her stepmother was strained. Some accounts say that she was jealous of her relationship with her father and kind of taking attention away from the wife. Mary from a young age was curious and loved to read and read a lot in her father's bookshop that he owned and operated. And through that, she learned languages, philosophy, literature, and history. And Godwin had a lot of intellectual friends that he knew that were also sort of activists and people who were really intelligent and liked literature and things, and he would have them over to have discussions and talks and gatherings. And then Mary would also be present for those and learn a lot from other people. Even though her father was attentive, she often found herself being very alone and wanting of a mother, and would even go to her mother's grave often to visit her and to sit there and read. But she was very intelligent for her age, and at the age of 10, she wrote a book called Monsieur Nong Tong Pa. I hope I said that right. Now that I have the outline of the shape that I want, I'm going to start using the Sin Wax. If you guys would like a more in-depth tutorial of how to use this, I will make this in a separate video. Just let me know in the comments. The idea here is to take a little piece of it and kind of make it look like the skin is kind of coming up and then the rest of it will be smoothed into the rest of my skin to make it look like it's one piece. And then to smooth it more, if you need to, you can use petroleum jelly. I'm going to walk you through this first part, and then afterwards you can kind of just see I'm doing the same repetitious things over and over. You take a little bit of the sin wax out, and I usually knead it between my fingers to kind of warm it up and soften it. Then from there, you're going to want to kind of flatten it and make it the shape you want. And I'm going to kind of put it here, and as you can see, I'm going to leave this part kind of untouched so it looks like a flap of skin kind of hanging over this open area, and this is going to be like the exposed muscles. Then I'm going to smooth this into my skin. I'm taking a little bit of the liquid latex, and I'm just going to put a little bit here, and you're going to want to just leave it for a second and let it get tacky. This kind of sticks on its own, but I like to use a little bit because it can fall off. So I'll put that there. Then a little bit of this, push down and start smoothing it into your skin. You kind of got to use a little bit of force. As you can see, it'll start looking like it's kind of coming up, like it's your actual skin. Be careful to get it in your hair. I always end up getting it in there anyway, but it can be hard to remove from your hair. And then I usually kind of push this back a little bit so it starts to look like it's coming up. And then we're going to continue this pretty much all the way down. So throughout her adolescence and teenage years, she had a lot of bad headaches and even a skin condition on one of her arms that got so bad that sometimes she wasn't able to use it. There were never really any answers on what the condition was. During her teenage years, things became a little bit more contentious with the new stepmother, and so her father knew about this and wanted there to be peace, so he decided to send her off to his friend that lived in Scotland. And this man was William Baxter, and he was also considered a radical philosopher. He believed in education for the masses, and he even founded a public library in Dundee. And while in Scotland, she became friends with Isabel and Christina, his daughters, and they were kind of given free rein to go and explore the city and to see things. And she credited this time for allowing her to kind of get her thoughts together and to kind of work on her writing skill. But in 1914, now at the age of 16, she had an encounter that would change her life forever, because this is when she met Percy Bysshe Shelley, now age 21, and she met him when he was on his way to his regular visits to see her father. So Percy had been writing since his days in college, and he wrote his first Gothic novel called Zadarozzi. Again, these names, I'm sorry if I didn't say that right. And at that time, he was 18. He was from a wealthy family, but rejected that family due to reading some of Godwin's work, including his work, The Inquiry Concerning Public Justice, and began to hold the idea that wealthy families such as his should distribute their wealth to the poorer people. And his family did not share his newfound beliefs and sort of ostracized him. He became disowned by his father, Sir Timothy Shelley. And because of this, he kind of wanted a new father figure, mentor, and came to Godwin to seek a mentorship. And Godwin ended up agreeing to it. And so now Percy was around a lot and started taking a greater interest in Mary. But there was one major problem with that. Percy Shelley was already married. So he had met his first wife, Harriet Westbrook, who was 16 years old and was a school friend of his sister's, in 1810 when he was at Oxford, which he promptly got kicked out of because he was out there at school distributing his philosophical works, one of which being The Necessity of Atheism. During this time, he convinced Harriet that she was being oppressed by her school, by society, and her parents, and convinced her to go off and elope with him. After that, both of their parents ended up cutting them off, but eventually her parents allowed her to have her allowance, and then Percy used that to fund his lifestyle. She then afterwards began to help him distribute his works in Dublin, and they had their first daughter, Ianthe, in 1813. But because of them living beyond their means and his financial situation, he always had to dodge creditors and was always here and there and everywhere. And it was said that he had roving eyes, and that led to their relationship kind of falling apart. But by the time that happened, she was already pregnant with their second child. During this time period, there was no real legal recourse for women who wanted to get divorces, and so there wasn't really anything that Harriet could have done about this. But even though he was married, Percy and Mary fell in love. They would go on these walks around town and talk about politics and literature and history, and he felt like he had finally met his intellectual match. But it wasn't just her mind that he was interested in. They had claimed their feelings for each other, and it is said that they consummated their love very nearby her mother's grave. Percy had these grand ideas of free love and being in relationships with multiple people. And at the time, they said that Mary had agreed with these philosophies, but it seems like this type of ideal caused them problems later in their relationship. But Mary's father had caught wind of this relationship and obviously was aware of the fact that Percy was married, and he forbid Mary to see him. She just couldn't understand why he would do this, why he would stand in the way of their love, and so they decided to go off and elope together. So they ran away to France in 1814 and took her stepsister Claire with them. But even though they are said to have eloped, they could not get married because he was already married to Harriet. So they were living as if they were married, but they really legally weren't. Now, I'm gonna put a little bit of it right here above my eyebrow. I should have given myself more room because now it's gonna kind of go into it a little bit. It's fine. This is gonna be kind of the area where there's like gonna be a line to look like the skin is cut, but it's gonna be closer together and not like separating as much. Putting a little right there. I'm not sure if this is the best way to go about it, but that's what we're doing. I'm gonna carefully take one of these palette knives and just make sure there's a line right in between. After Mary ran off, her father disowned her and didn't want to speak to her anymore. But Mary was happy to be with Percy and Claire, living this new life, and was quoted as saying it was like they were acting in a novel, an incarnate romance. In Europe during this time was in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, and there was quite a bit of strife and turmoil in this area. And they still visited places like Germany, Switzerland, and France, and kind of had a honeymoon type period where they were traveling around, but they ended up running out of money and had to make their way back to London. But on their return journey, they went to Germany and they visited a hilltop castle that had been rumored to be the home of a controversial and infamous alchemist, and his name was Johann Conrad Dippel. And he was rumored to have done interesting experiments on the dead, and also had connections to making an elixir of life, and even was known to dig up people from graves for these experiments. And this castle was known as none other than Frankenstein. Mary had never disclosed exactly what her inspirations were for her Frankenstein story, but it's hard for me to believe that this wasn't a part of that inspiration. Now back in England, their financial situation had not improved, and her father still refused to see her. But at this time, Mary found herself pregnant, and actually was quite ill most of the time. And due to that, now Percy began showing a little bit more interest in Claire, her stepsister. And then when Harriet, Percy's first wife, gave birth to their second child, who she had been pregnant with for a while, he began to go and visit her more and more as well. It was also suggested by Percy that Mary take on his friend Thomas Hogg as a lover during this time. Apparently he was encouraging her to act as he was. But in February 1815, Mary gave birth to her first daughter, but sadly it only lived for a few days. The loss of her child and the growing infidelity of her husband at this time led her to be in a deep depression. After the loss of this child, she had haunting visions all the time and very bad nightmares. So this was a very sad and trying time for Mary, as one might imagine. But by that next summer, she was pregnant again. But by this time, Sir Shelley, Percy's grandfather, had died and left him some money, so they were a little bit better off than they were before. And it was unclear to me exactly when this happened, but her stepsister Claire, the one that had been living with them, at some point met Lord Byron, who will become a greater character later on in the story, and she had somewhat of an affair with him and became pregnant with his child at this time. And at this time they moved to a cottage near Windsor, and there she had her son William in 1816. So 3 months after their son was born, they decided to go on a little trip to see Lord Byron, their friend. They were meeting in Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and at the Villa Diodati. Not only were they just visiting their friend, but they were actually taking Claire and their newborn child to meet Byron for the first time. A little bit of background on Lord Byron. He was someone that I've heard about a lot in like literature, but I didn't really ever know who he was. He is a poet, and he was quite well known and quite famous throughout the literature world. And he created the term that we now use as a Byronic hero. And he was dubbed mad, bad, and dangerous to know. That's what people had to say about him back in the day. And he had a lot of scandals that surrounded him as well. And something that was surprising to me to find out is he is the father of Ada Lovelace. She is someone that I had planned on doing a video about as well. She was a brilliant mathematician, and she was considered the world's first computer programmer. And she was Byron's only legitimate child. And so they all met to hang out at this villa. So it was Mary, Percy, and Claire, and the little children, and then also Lord Byron's friend that was a doctor, a physician, that were staying at this villa. And this year, 1816, was called the year without a summer because the year prior in Indonesia there was a volcanic eruption that ended up putting a lot of things into the air and changed the way the atmosphere behaved. And it was really rainy where they were, so much so that like any outdoor kind of activity was just impossible to do. It was so rainy and they couldn't really go outside. So they had to find other things inside to entertain them. So on the dark, stormy night, they were talking about ghost stories and different sort of scientific things that they had come across that were interesting to them. And these discussions were accompanied by lots of alcohol and laudanum. So it probably got very interesting very quickly. One of the things that were brought up as a point of discussion with Percy and Lord Byron was the idea of galvanism. It was an 18th century study of using electricity on dead animals, is what they were using at the time, to see if they could reanimate that flesh, kind of make the muscles contract and move with the power of electricity. And apparently this greatly interested Mary and might have also been part of the inspiration for Frankenstein. So one particular night they were reading to each other from Phantasmagoria, which is a French collection of ghost stories, and then Byron, getting bored with those stories, suggested that they all come up with one of their own and kind of have a little friendly competition of who is going to write the best one. So each of them kind of retreated to their own area and started to write. It is said that Percy, while doing this, began to hallucinate. Not sure if that's because of the laudanum or he just got so far into his story or what have you, but he ended up only writing a little bit of a ghost story and never finished it. Byron too began a story, but then just kind of became bored with it. His story was not as interesting as he thought it was going to be, and he abandoned it. And at first Mary kind of struggled as well to write a ghost story. A ghost story wasn't necessarily what she had in mind, but when she started thinking about the different elements of galvanism again and what is the essence of life, she decided to write down her Frankenstein story. And Frankenstein is widely considered to be the first sci-fi story. So not only did she create a brand new story, she pretty much created a new genre of literature. So I went ahead and finished the face and then I did the neck. I know it's extremely red looking. I'm not breaking out or anything. I just get very red very easily. So in 1816, they had gotten some troubling letters. Both Percy and Mary had received troubling letters from Fanny. And Fanny, if you remember, was Mary's half-sister, the one that her mother had had from a previous relationship. And because they were distressed by kind of the contents of these letters and what seemed to be her mental state, they decided that they would go back to England to see her, check on her, see how she was. But by the time they got there, it was too late. She had apparently taken her life with laudanum and left letters behind. This weighed heavily both on Mary and Percy because it is believed that the reason that she might have done this is because Fanny was also in love with Percy. I don't know at what time period they had been together even in this timeline. It was hard for me to find out that information. So not only was Percy involved with Mary, he also was involved with her stepsister Claire and apparently her half-sister Fanny in some way, shape, or form. But in 1816, Harriet Shelley, Percy Shelley's first wife, was found drowned in a river, in the Serpentine River in Hyde Park, London. And she left behind her children with a letter detailing her unhappiness and her mental state. And she was pregnant at the time. Some believe that might have even been Percy Shelley's child. It is claimed that she could not stand to be away from Percy now that he was with Mary, and that might have contributed to her possibly taking her own life. It is not clearly stated whether or not she accidentally drowned, and it was said that she didn't like having to move back in with her father after Percy left her to be with Mary, and that might have been part of the reason that she did what she did, is that she didn't like being away from Percy. So to be clear, he is speculated as being part of the reason why two separate women did what they did. And I hope that it is clear how I feel about this man. I will not say what I want to say, but just know. Now, I would never put the blame on someone else when someone takes an action like this, but it is crazy to me that two separate women did something similar that were connected to Percy. And Percy reportedly felt guilt over the situation with his first wife, but that did leave Mary and Percy to be able to get married legally. And now that they were legally married, Mary's father began talking to them again. Now with this darker red shade, I'm going to fill in the areas in between kind of where we have the separation. So now Percy wanted his children from Harriet to live with him, to be with him, and her family was not okay with that. There was a very big custody battle for them. They said that he was unfit due to his political affiliations, his scandalous lifestyle and affairs, and the fact that he was an atheist. It appears that the courts agreed with them because his children went to live with a clergyman instead of him. So even with all this heartbreak surrounding them, she continued to work on her Frankenstein book, and it was completed by the time she was pregnant with her third child, her daughter Clara. So now I'm going to be doing the skin tone. In the book, it's described as sort of a yellowy, greenish, sickly kind of look, and so I'm going to be using mostly yellow but with a little bit of green and kind of doing a light wash over the skin. I'm not just going to go in and use this like I normally would. I'm going to be doing like a very thin layer, and I might have to do several layers to kind of build up the color. But I don't want it to just look like yellow paint put on the skin. I want it to almost look like the yellow is coming from my skin. So she finished the book finally and published it in 1818. And it was published first anonymously. And the book was dedicated to her father. I'm getting a little too yellow almost. I need to kind of, I don't know, putting like, we'll see. We might have to put some powder over the top. And Percy was the one who did the foreword of the book, and because of that, people thought that he wrote Frankenstein. And to me, like, it makes me mad that he would even put any of himself in her book. I know she probably allowed it and wanted it, but like, after all the stuff, you're gonna take her spotlight and put yourself in it, and then now people are gonna think that you did it. And for the time period, women could publish things, so she could have put her name on it. Because like people thought that like women couldn't do real literature, something that was like smart and intelligent, she decided to make it anonymous. And the book was initially met with kind of mixed reviews. People, in the way that they think back in the day, like they didn't really know what to make of it. It does sort of question the essence of life and what is life, and can we as humans create other lives and things like that. Sort of like playing God. And so I'm sure a lot of like more religious people were not happy with that kind of sentiment. But some people really liked it and thought it was an interesting story. And then when it did come out that Mary had wrote it, people, some of them were skeptical, but others were impressed that she was the one who did it. But the book became quite popular and considered a success. But even with writing a book, their financial situation remained pretty much the same. She didn't receive a lot of money for it. And Percy was still having to like dodge creditors and things, and he would be gone for days at a time before he'd come back home. And I'm sure he was off doing whatever he wanted to do. But apparently they wanted to move away so that they could flee from having to do that. And so they decided to move to Italy in March of 1818. But this era of their life ends up being really tragic for them. Clara, their daughter, barely only a year old, dies from dysentery in 1818. And then less than a year later, in June of 1918, their son William dies of malaria. So now Mary has lost all of her children. This is almost looking too yellow to me, almost like The Simpsons. I might have to do something with it in a minute to lighten it. But I'm gonna put the first initial coat down and then see where we go from there. Mary, after the loss of all of her children, was very depressed, which obviously so. I don't know anyone who wouldn't be. And Percy during this time was writing a lot. Percy became despondent with Mary and how she just didn't want to do anything, was very depressed, very sad, very forlorn. And he found it hard to handle her in her low spirits. Only a few months after the death of their son, Percy decides to adopt a 8-week-old baby girl named Alina, and scholars say it was probable that that child was his. But who is the mother? Some say it's a mystery, and some believe that it might actually be Claire and his child. Now, was Mary aware of the parentage of this child? Who's to say? And I just have to say, the audacity of this man to bring that in upon your grieving wife after she just lost all of her own children. You want to bring someone else's child for her to take care of. I can't imagine she looked upon that situation favorably. I'm going to take some of these brown shades and kind of make the skin look a little bit more decrepit. I'm thinking this might kind of tone down the greenish yellow hue we got going on. I'm trying to leave this area kind of open because I wanted to make some like veining. I'm going to kind of hollow out my collarbone here so it looks a little bit more sickly, a little bit more sunken, if you will. A little bit of a cheekbone here. But then that baby died that summer. They've lost so many children at this point. From there, they moved to Rome, and her depression deepens even more. And it's said that she's even had thoughts of taking her own life. But at this time, she was still writing, and she wrote her second novel, Matilda, which is another dark gothic story, but this one is a little bit different. It is about a woman whose beauty was so beautiful that it caused her father to have lustful thoughts of her. And in order to not do that, he ends up taking his own life, not to act on those ideas. And then she wanted her father to publish it with the people that he knew in the industry and the books he was selling. And he read it and he thought it was distasteful and downright disgusting, and he refused to have anything to do with it. So it remained unpublished at the time, but was published about 100 years later. Some historians think that it might have hit too close to home for him, and that's why he felt a certain way. I feel like that's kind of an interesting choice to make for a book subject, and wonder myself where the inspiration for that may have come from. I'm not saying anyone did anything, but it just seems like a weird book to write. And Percy during this time was having a lot of medical problems of his own. He was having frequent nervous attacks and what some believe might have even been epilepsy. I'm going to do some kind of brown and red around the eyes, sort of as eye makeup, but also to make it kind of look like irritated, almost as if like he were crying. He's supposed to be sort of a sorrowful monster, so I kind of want to add that element to it. Then Mary has another child, and his name is Percy Florence, named after his father and the city in which he was born. And Mary continued to write, and this time writing a historical novel named Valperga. They moved to a small seaside Riviera in 1822, but Mary did not like it there for whatever reason. She just didn't like living there. But then sadly, Claire and Byron's daughter Allegra died of typhus. I feel like these muscle areas need a little something, and I'm going to go in with white, and I'm going to kind of try to make very faint striations to make it look like muscle texture. I think I do want to put like a gloss. I kind of like it. I'm just carefully putting it on top, just a light layer, because I don't want it to really ruin the striations we made. But I think giving it this wet look will give it a little something. Then I'm using the Ben Nye color wheel, and this will help me create veins that look like they're coming from underneath the skin. I was kind of thinking I might have the blood kind of dripping from this side, so I'm going to be using some fake blood. Then in June 1822, Mary had a miscarriage that was really bad and caused her to hemorrhage, and she lost so much blood that she might have died. But apparently Percy thought of putting her in an ice bath, and that was the thing that saved her. And she often didn't feel well and was ill after this, and was still sort of not in the best mental space after going through something like that. And during this time, Percy also was having bad mental states because he was having nightmares and just sort of hallucinations and visions. It said that he was having visions of Allegra, which would have been Claire and Byron's daughter. Not really sure why that's the thing, and not like your wife having this bad hemorrhage and all of your own children who are no longer here. Then he also had nightmares that included his friends that were staying with him at the time, which were Jane and Edward Williams. He had nightmares of them becoming sort of the Walking Dead, being zombies, or strangling Mary. And Percy, during this time, turns his attention to none other than Jane Williams. There was not a woman around who he was not interested in. It is said that he liked that she was more traditionally feminine and sort of did more of the wifely, motherly role in the household. Now I'm going to move on to placing the staples. I know traditionally Frankenstein is with stitches, but I always like to use staples, and I'm going to quickly show you the staples that I use. These ones are industrial staples, very big, and I snip them down and make them shorter. I like doing this because this gives it a thicker end and more area for it to adhere to the skin. If you just use the kind that you use with paper, they're very thin and don't have much to stick on the bottom. If you'd like a more in-depth tutorial about how I do the staples, I can do a separate video on that as well. But what I do is I take the staples that I've already cut down, I dip them in a little bit of liquid latex, and then I put them on the vase. So I'm gonna place one of them right here. You can place them all sort of like in the same like up and down, but I kind of like to have some of them diagonal, some of them going every which way. So he took an interest in his friend's wife, Jane Williams, and he even wrote some very passionate poems about her and read them aloud in the presence of company. The way that I would have been known far and wide as Bloody Mary, if he had the audacity to do that to me, I cannot tell you the hatred I feel for this man. Really and truly, and you can say that I'm putting my own modern feelings and the way that society is now and the way that I think on the matter, but I don't care. So be it then. So in 1822, Percy and his friends decide to go on a little trip to visit Byron again, just the boys. And they visited Lord Byron for a while, and then on the way back there was a terrible storm. Then Mary received a letter asking if they had made it home safely, and she had not seen them yet. 3 days later, 3 bodies were washed up on the shore, and they were able to identify Percy by the letters and things in his pocket. Mary was distraught by this news, but she was unable to travel because she was too ill, and so she was not there for the funeral that they had. At first, he was buried in the sand, but they dug him back up and exhumed his body to have a cremation. But before they could cremate all of his body, their friend Edward Trelawney decided to take his heart to bring back to Mary. And Mary, through it all, still loved him and was very devastated by his death. She supposedly kept his heart in a drawer, although some people said that she carried it around with her, wrapped in silk. And the part that struck me the most about this part of the story was this is the first time she has ever held his heart in its entirety. And she was loyal to him till the end, and she never remarried. And his death left her and her son Percy Florence in a very bad financial situation. She did make some money from the first edition kind of being sold out of Frankenstein, but in 1831 she sold the rights to it for £30. The book description has the lips as being black, so I'm going to be using a black lip stain. I also added some eyelashes because I can't resist. I feel like it makes it look more complete, so I decided to add them. So now with no income, Mary and her son Percy had to move back in with her father, and she had asked Sir Timothy Shelley, which is Percy's father, for any financial aid. At first, he agreed to give her money only if she would give up her son, I guess going to live with him instead, but she said no. But then he reconsidered and said he would give her a small allowance as long as she promised to never make a biography or a memoir about Percy. During this time, she was going through all of Percy's poems and things that hadn't been published in his journals and letters, and was trying to edit those for publication. And a man named John Howard, who was an American, asked her to marry him, and she declined these marriage offers and said since I had married a genius before, she could only marry another genius. Then Percy's first son with Harriet died, leaving Percy Florence to be the heir of his grandfather's estate when his grandfather would die. The loss of their husbands created a greater bond between Mary and Jane Williams, her friend from before, and some speculated they may have had romantic feelings for one another, but this has not been confirmed. But she did move to be closer to Jane, and she wrote another novel called Last Man, and it was an apocalyptic type book about the last man alive, and supposedly she modeled the main character after her husband Percy. Then in 1824, Lord Byron passed away from a fever that he got when he was in the Greek War of Independence. Then in 1830, she published her next book, The Fortunes of Perkin Warbeck, which was a historical romance. And here I'm just adding some highlights to a few areas just to kind of add a little bit of depth to the facial features. Then she wrote a book called Lordor in 1835, which was about kind of a family with troubles and tribulations. And then her book Faulkner in 1837, which is another Gothic story about an orphan falling in love with a criminal. And Mary's father, William Godwin, died in 1836. And after that, she began to put all of his letters and things together to create a memoir. But she actually kind of put that aside and again was working on Percy's book of collected works. And even though she was not allowed to make a memoir, she kind of got around this by like putting her own sort of blurbs at the end of his poems, and through those kind of telling his life story, even though she had promised that she wouldn't. And she continued to align with her feminist principles by helping women in need, including Mary Diana Dodds, who was a lesbian, who was a single mother and also was known for dressing and appearing as a man, and another woman that she knew, Georgiana Paul, who was kicked out by her husband for alleged adultery. She would do whatever she could to help other women in need. Then Percy Florence's grandfather, Sir Timothy, decided that he would pay for his schooling, and he went to the Harrow School, and they moved closer to that school so that he wouldn't have to board there and could live at home. And Mary wrote her last book, which was Rambles in Germany and Italy, where she kind of talked about her time there. Percy Florence ended up going to Cambridge College, and he inherited his father's estate when he died in 1844. And 4 years later, he married Jane Gibson, who was the illegitimate daughter of a banker. And Mary would travel with them and do things with them and kind of live with them until she got too ill to do so. She had bad headaches, as she had when she was younger. She kind of had them throughout her life, and she had severely bad headaches now, and one side of her body sometimes would become paralyzed. In 1847, they thought she had neuralgia of the heart, and they tried to do a surgery on her to sort of relieve her of some of the symptoms, but it actually ended up being worse for her. She was left having seizures and sometimes even lost the ability to talk. And she had these spells that people thought had been hysteria, but actually now we believe they were severe migraines. And in 1851, she died at the age of 53, surrounded by her family, and they believe that she succumbed to a brain tumor. She wanted to be buried with her parents at the gravesite where she used to go and read and talk to her mother, but that area apparently had become kind of a low-rent area, and Percy Florence did not want to have her there, so he had her put at a better one and then had her parents moved to be with her, and placed with her so that they could be together for all of eternity was Percy's heart. Percy Florence did not inherit his parents' writing skills, but he loved them and wanted to memorialize them, and doing so published many of their works after their death. But Percy did not have any children, and the line ended with him. I think Mary Shelley was a woman ahead of her time, a woman who lived life on her terms, someone who went through unimaginable tragedies but still found a way to create something and give it new life. I think she had a lot of fire and tenacity in her, and I love that in a woman, and I love that her story is still being talked about to this day. Countless other stories have taken inspiration from Frankenstein, and there's even a lot of original stories that are loosely based on Frankenstein, like Young Frankenstein, Edward Scissorhands, Ex Machina, and even parts of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And it's hard to imagine how different the movie and literary worlds would be without her influence. I have read Frankenstein myself and I loved it. It is one of my favorite classic books. I love it both for the gothic atmosphere, but also the questions it poses about life and death and what happens when humanity decides to play God. It's a very interesting book, and I would definitely suggest it if you haven't read it already. And I hope that this story about Mary Shelley will make you more inspired to read it. Mary Shelley did not just write Frankenstein. She proved that a young woman's voice, no matter how overlooked, can change the world. And in doing so, she helped create an entire genre. If you'd like to support the future generations of women's voices, consider donating to Girls Right Now, a nationally award-winning non-for-profit with a focus on those historically disempowered due to their gender and gender identity. We harness the power of stories to shape culture, impact industries, and bridge worlds. If you want to hear more stories like this and see more makeup transformations, be sure to subscribe for the next Fearless Face episode. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.